Millionaire rescues a weakened horse from a slaughterhouse, but he had no idea about the secret it was hiding. The Kentucky morning stretched before Mason Whitfield like a painting he'd purchased but never truly looked at. His newly acquired estate, Rolling Hills Ranch, sprawled across 300 acres of prime bluegrass country, an impulsive acquisition made during a particularly stressful quarter at Whitfield Capital. At 52, Mason had amassed more wealth than most people would see in 10 lifetimes, yet the hollowness that echoed through his penthouse in Manhattan followed him even here, to the rolling countryside. If you found this story interesting, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Let us know which city you're watching from. We keep going. Mr. Whitfield, the property inspection is scheduled for 10, said Elaine, his personal assistant, not looking up from her tablet. In 15 years, she'd never addressed him by his first name. Sometimes he wondered if she even remembered it. Schedule it for tomorrow, Mason replied, his eyes fixed on the horizon. I'd like to explore the grounds myself today. Elaine's perfectly manicured nail paused mid-swipe. You want to walk around? Alone? Mason almost smiled at her bewilderment. Contrary to popular belief, I do know how to use my legs. He dismissed her with a wave and headed toward the stables. The ranch had come fully staffed, farmhands, groundskeepers, and stable managers who were as surprised by their new employer's sudden appearance as they were by his lack of entourage. Mason had arrived alone, save for Elaine, and had made it clear he wanted minimal interaction. The solitude was part of why he'd purchased the place. The morning air carried the earthy scent of hay and leather as Mason approached the stables. He wasn't sure what drew him there. He hadn't been on a horse since a mandatory riding lesson during a business retreat in Aspen nearly a decade ago, yet something about the quiet dignity of the animals had always appealed to him. As he rounded a bend in the path, the sound of voices caught his attention. Following them, he came upon a small gathering about half a mile from his property line. A makeshift corral had been erected, and inside it stood about a dozen horses, most looking underfed and dejected. What's going on here? Mason asked a weathered-looking man leaning against a fence post. Horse auction, the man replied, not bothering to look at Mason. Heading to the slaughterhouse after. Might as well try to make a few bucks first. Mason felt his stomach turn. These horses are being sold for slaughter. The man shrugged. Most are past their prime. Too expensive to keep feeding something. That can't work. Mason was about to walk away when a movement from the corral caught his eye. Among the gathered horses stood one that seemed different from the rest, not in appearance, but in presence. A once magnificent bay thoroughbred, now with dulled coat and protruding ribs, stood slightly apart from the others. Despite its weakened state, the horse held its head with a dignity that spoke of better days. But it was the animal's eyes that truly arrested Mason, deep, intelligent eyes that seemed to look not at him, but into him. In that brief connection, Mason felt something he hadn't experienced in years: recognition. That one, Mason said, pointing to the bay. What's his story? The man finally turned to look at Mason, sizing him up. Nobody knows much. Was found wandering near abandoned property. Good breeding, though. Probably from one of them fancy racing stables that went bankrupt last year. Shame to waste good horse flesh, but he's too far gone for rehabilitation. Mason walked closer to the corral. The horse watched him approach, ears forward, eyes never leaving his face. Up close, Mason could see small scars across the animal's flank, patterned in a way that seemed almost deliberate. How much? Mason asked. For that one? The man laughed. He's scheduled for the afternoon transport. Wouldn't waste your money. Mason turned, his face hardening into the expression that had made junior analysts tremble. I didn't ask for your financial advice. I asked for a price. 10 minutes later, Mason was walking back to his property, leading the reluctant thoroughbred by a hastily purchased lead rope. He'd paid 10 times what the horse was worth as meat, earning bemused looks from the auction handlers and outright shock from the ranch hands who saw him returning. "Mr. Whitfield." Elaine hurried across the lawn, tablet clutched to her chest like a shield. "What on earth are you doing?" "I bought a horse," Mason stated the obvious, continuing toward the stables. "But why?" Elaine struggled to keep pace with him. "You don't ride, and this animal looks—" She searched for a diplomatic word. "Unwell." Mason didn't answer immediately. The truth was, he wasn't entirely sure himself. Something in the animal's gaze had triggered an unfamiliar impulse, one that had nothing to do with profit margins or strategic acquisitions. "Call Dr. Reynolds," he said finally. "Tell her I need her best equine veterinarian out here today." By evening, the rumors had already begun circulating among the staff. The cold, calculating Mason Whitfield, notorious for his ruthless business practices and emotional detachment, had saved a horse from slaughter. The story grew with each telling. He'd paid a fortune. He'd threatened the auction master. He'd wept when he saw the animal's condition. The truth was less dramatic, but perhaps more significant. For the first time in years, Mason had acted without analyzing the benefits or calculating the return on investment. It was a small crack in the careful facade he'd constructed, and like most small cracks, it had the potential to spread. Dr. Sarah Tanner arrived just before sundown, a no-nonsense veterinarian who seemed unmoved by both Mason's wealth and his reputation. She examined the horse thoroughly, her expressions shifting between concern and curiosity. "He's malnourished and dehydrated," she said finally, removing her stethoscope. "There's muscle atrophy from disuse, but no permanent damage that I can detect. With proper care, he should recover physically." "But," Mason prompted, sensing her hesitation. Dr. Tanner ran her hand along the horse's neck, where a pattern of small scars was visible beneath the coarse hair. "These markings aren't accidental, and look at these." She pointed to similar marks along the animal's flank. "Something was attached here, repeatedly." "What kind of something?" "I can't say for certain, but I've worked with race horses for 15 years, and I've never seen tack that would leave marks like these." She paused, then added, "There's more. This horse has been trained extensively. See how he responds to basic commands. That's not typical of a neglected animal. Someone invested significant time in him before he was abandoned." Mason found himself strangely troubled by this information. "Can you find out where he came from? Racing horses have registrations, tattoos, something?" "Normally, yes," Dr. Tanner pointed to the inside of the horse's lip. "There should be a tattoo here, but it's been deliberately removed. Someone wanted this horse's identity erased." After Dr. Tanner left, with strict instructions for the horse's care, Mason found himself returning to the stables. The night staff had departed, leaving only the soft sounds of horses shifting in their stalls. The bay thoroughbred stood alert. As Mason approached, ears pricked forward, eyes watchful, Mason extended his hand slowly, and after a moment's hesitation, the horse stretched its neck to sniff his palm. "What happened to you?" Mason asked softly. "And why did someone want to erase your past?" As if in answer, the horse nudged Mason's shoulder gently. It was such a simple gesture, yet it stirred something long dormant in Mason's chest, a feeling that bordered dangerously close to connection. That night, Mason made 2 decisions. First, he would name the horse Phoenix, for reasons he couldn't quite articulate. Second, he would uncover the mystery of Phoenix's past, regardless of where it led. What Mason couldn't know was that his impulsive purchase had already set in motion events that would unravel secrets far beyond a horse's mysterious scars. Secrets that powerful people had gone to great lengths to bury, and would go to even greater lengths to keep hidden. In his Manhattan office, Mason had built his reputation on seeing patterns others missed. Now, those same instincts were telling him that Phoenix was more than just an abandoned racehorse. The pattern of scars, the deliberate removal of identifying marks, the intelligence in those eyes, they all pointed to something larger. As Mason returned to the main house, his phone buzzed with a message from his head of security. The background check on the previous owner of Rolling Hills Ranch had revealed some anomalies: shell companies, rapid transfers of ownership, and connections to Westridge Agricultural Holdings, one of the largest agribusiness conglomerates in the country, headed by the charismatic and politically connected Richard Westridge. Mason paused on the veranda, looking back toward the stables where Phoenix now rested. The impulse that had led him to save one horse had inadvertently connected him to a mystery that stretched far beyond the borders of his new property. And, for the first time in longer than he could remember, Mason felt something that had been absent from his carefully controlled life. Genuine curiosity. Elaine found him there an hour later, still staring toward the stables, his usual mask of indifference replaced by an expression she hadn't seen in years: determination. "Sir," she ventured, "is everything all right?" Mason turned, and Elaine was startled by the intensity in his eyes. "Schedule a meeting with my investigator," he said, "and clear my calendar for the next month. I'll be staying at Rolling Hills longer than planned." 2 weeks after Mason's unusual purchase, Phoenix had already begun to transform. The dull coat now gleamed with health, muscles were slowly rebuilding beneath the once gaunt frame, and the intelligent eyes watched Mason's every move with growing trust. Dr. Tanner visited regularly, expressing surprise at the animal's rapid recovery. "It's like he knows he's been given a second chance," she remarked during her latest examination. "I've never seen such determination in a horse." Mason had taken to spending his mornings in the stables, something that continued to bewilder his staff. The man who once couldn't spare 5 minutes for a board meeting without checking his watch now sat for hours on an overturned bucket, simply watching Phoenix eat or rest. "Mr. Whitfield," called a voice from the stable entrance. Jake Donovan, Mason's head of security, walked in carrying a thick folder. A former FBI analyst with a reputation for discretion, Jake had been on Mason's payroll for 5 years, handling everything from corporate espionage concerns to background checks on potential business partners. "You found something," Mason stated, noting Jake's expression. Jake glanced at Phoenix, then back to Mason. "Several somethings, actually, none of which make much sense." He opened the folder and extracted a photograph. "This is Clearwater Stables, about 40 miles from here. It was a prestigious breeding and training operation until 18 months ago, when a series of unfortunate events forced them into bankruptcy." "What kind of events?" "First, a fire destroyed their main training facilities. Insurance would have covered it, but then came financial irregularities, missing funds, discrepancies in their accounts. The owner, Thomas Wilson, was a respected figure in racing circles. No history of financial problems. Then suddenly he's facing fraud accusations. He maintained his innocence, but the evidence seemed overwhelming." Mason took the photograph, studying the once grand facility. "And you think Phoenix came from there?" I showed Dr. Tanner's photos to a former employee who was willing to talk. He recognized Phoenix immediately, said his racing name was Midnight Whisper. Apparently, he was their most promising 3-year-old before everything fell apart. "So how did a valuable racehorse end up at a slaughter auction with his identification removed?" Jake hesitated. "That's where things get murky. According to records, all of Clearwater's horses were sold at legitimate auctions when the stable went bankrupt. But this employee, Kyle Jennings, former groom, says several horses simply disappeared overnight. When he asked questions, he was fired." "Where is this Kyle now?" "That's the other thing," Jake said, shifting uncomfortably. "He's not exactly stable. After Clearwater collapsed, he developed a drinking problem. Lives in a trailer on the Outskirts of Lexington. Most people write him off as a conspiracy theorist. Mason stood, brushing hay from his slacks. I want to talk to him. Jake looked skeptical. Sir, he's not the most reliable source. I've built a career on finding patterns where others see coincidence, Mason interrupted. Arrange a meeting. Later that afternoon, Mason found himself outside a dilapidated trailer in one of Lexington's less prosperous areas. Jake had insisted on accompanying him, clearly uncomfortable with his employer's presence in such surroundings. Kyle. Jennings opened the door after the third knock, bleary-eyed and suspicious. Who are you? He demanded, alcohol evident on his breath. My name is Mason Whitfield. I'd like to ask you about a horse called Midnight Whisper. Something flickered in Kyle's bloodshot eyes. Recognition, followed immediately by fear. Don't. Know nothing about any horses, he muttered, attempting to close the door. Mason blocked it with his foot. I own him now. He was being sold for slaughter when I found him. Kyle froze, then slowly reopened the door. You have Whisper, and you're still walking around? He laughed, a hollow sound tinged with genuine disbelief. Either you're lying or you're a dead man walking. I assure you I'm very much alive, Mason replied evenly, and I'd like to understand why someone went to such lengths to erase that horse's identity. Kyle glanced nervously past Mason, scanning the area before stepping back. You better come inside. Not safe talking about this where people might hear. The trailer's interior was cluttered but surprisingly clean. Kyle moved a stack of newspapers from a chair, gesturing for Mason to sit. Jake remained standing, his posture tense. Whisper wasn't just any horse, Kyle began, lowering his voice despite being indoors. He was special, too smart for his own good. Thomas, Mr. Wilson, he used to say Whisper understood English better than some of his riders. What happened to Clearwater Stables? Mason prompted. Kyle's face darkened. Official story? Bad luck and worse management? Truth? They were targeted, systematically destroyed. By whom? There are races most people don't know about, Kyle said, leaning forward. Private tracks, invitation-only events, million-dollar stakes. No regulations, no oversight. Whisper was winning too consistently on the legitimate circuit, drawing attention. Then these men started showing up, expensive suits, foreign accents, watching our training sessions. Mr. Wilson refused to sell. Whisper, even when they offered amounts that made no sense for a horse that hadn't even peaked yet. After that, things started happening. The fire was just the beginning. Mason listened intently as Kyle described a systematic campaign of sabotage and intimidation. According to him, Thomas Wilson had discovered that these private races were a cover for something much larger, a way for certain individuals to exchange information and make deals away from prying eyes. The night before everything fell apart, I overheard Mr. Wilson arguing with someone in his office. He was saying he had proof that he knew what they were really using the horses for. Next morning, half our top horses are gone, including Whisper. Day after that, the fraud allegations hit the news. And nobody investigated the connection, Jake asked skeptically. Kyle gave a bitter laugh. Investigate who? Local police are in his pocket, and who'd believe a stable hand over a pillar? Of the agricultural community? Whose pocket? Mason pressed. Kyle seemed to shrink into himself. I've said too much already. You seem like a decent guy, so let me give you some advice. Sell that horse. Better yet, set him free somewhere far away. Pretend you never saw him. I need a name, Mason insisted. After a long moment, Kyle whispered, Richard Westridge, Westridge Agricultural Holdings. He reached for a nearly empty whiskey bottle on his coffee table. Everyone around here knows not to cross Westridge. Man's got judges, politicians, and half the state police on his Christmas list. The name confirmed what Mason's security team had already discovered, connections between Rolling Hill's previous owner and Westridge's sprawling business empire. It wasn't proof of wrongdoing, but it was another thread in an increasingly complex tapestry. As they were leaving, Kyle grabbed Mason's arm. "There's something else. Those marks on Whisper's side. I saw similar ones on other horses that disappeared. Once, I walked in on Mr. Wilson removing what looked like a small pouch from beneath. A saddle pad, custom designed, nearly invisible unless you knew to look for it. When he saw me, he acted like it was nothing, but he was nervous after that, watching me." "You think they were using the horses to transport something?" Kyle shrugged. "All I know is, after that day, I wasn't allowed near the horses before or after certain private exhibitions. A month later, everything fell apart." On the drive back to Rolling Hills, Mason processed Kyle's story. It aligned with the mysterious scars Dr. Tanner had pointed out, marks that could have been caused by something strapped to the horse's body. "You don't actually believe all that, do you?" Jake asked, breaking the silence. "The man's clearly an alcoholic with a persecution complex." "Parts of it, yes," Mason replied. "Enough to keep digging." He stared out the window at the passing Kentucky landscape. "I want everything you can find on Richard Westridge and these private racing events, and I want Phoenix's saddle and tack examined. Every inch." Back at Rolling Hills, Mason headed straight to the stables. Phoenix nickered softly as he approached, a sound that had become familiar over the past weeks. "What were you carrying?" Mason murmured, running his hand along the pattern of scars. "And who was so desperate to keep it secret?" As if sensing Mason's thoughts, Phoenix nudged his shoulder in what had become their ritual greeting. The simple gesture had an unexpected effect. Suddenly, Mason found himself thinking of his late father, who had built Whitfield Capital from nothing. In his final years, riddled with cancer, the once formidable financier had repeatedly warned his son about the cost of success without purpose. "Don't end up like me, Mason," he had said. "All this money, and the only person at my bedside is my son, who visits out of obligation." Mason had dismissed it as the sentimentality of a dying man. Now, standing beside a horse that had somehow slipped past his carefully constructed emotional barriers, those words returned with uncomfortable clarity. His phone buzzed, a message from Elaine about urgent matters, requiring his attention in New York. 6 months ago, he would have been on his private jet within the hour. Now, he found himself hesitating. Before he could reply, a different notification appeared, an email from an unknown sender. The subject line read simply, "Regarding your new acquisition." Mason opened it to find a single line of text. "Mr. Whitfield, I understand you recently purchased a horse of interest. I represent a client willing to offer substantially above market value for this animal. Please consider this a genuine opportunity for mutual benefit." The email was signed Jonathan Hayes, legal representative, with contact information for a prestigious Louisville law firm. Mason showed the message to Jake, who immediately began tracing the sender. "Could be innocuous," Jake suggested. "Word gets around in equestrian circles." "Possibly," Mason agreed, "or someone's noticed I'm asking questions." That evening, Mason instructed his security team to increase patrols around the property, particularly near the stables. He also arranged for Dr. Tanner to conduct a more thorough examination of Phoenix, focusing specifically on the unusual scar patterns. What had begun as an impulsive purchase was evolving into something far more complex. Mason had built his fortune by recognizing patterns and following them to their logical conclusion, a skill that had made him both wealthy and isolated. Now, those same instincts were drawing him into a mystery centered around a horse that, by all accounts, should have ended up as pet food. As Mason returned to the main house, he noticed a black SUV driving slowly past the front gates of Rolling Hills. The vehicle's windows were tinted too dark to see the occupants, but Mason felt a chill of certainty. Someone was watching. The question was, were they watching him or Phoenix? Either way, Mason had no intention of backing down. Whatever secrets Phoenix carried, they were now Mason's secrets too. And if there was one thing Mason Whitfield never did, it was surrender something that belonged to him. The examination of Phoenix's old tack yielded the breakthrough Mason had been waiting for. Dr. Tanner had brought specialized equipment to scan the leather saddle and found a hidden compartment so cleverly designed it was virtually invisible to the naked eye. "I've never seen anything like this," she admitted, carefully extracting a small object from the concealed pocket. "It's not part of any standard racing equipment." The object was a microchip, smaller than a postage stamp, encased in a waterproof housing. Mason immediately handed it to Jake, who departed to have it analyzed by a trusted tech expert. Over the next few days, Mason found himself rejecting call after call from Jonathan Hayes, the lawyer who had emailed about purchasing Phoenix. The offers kept increasing, evolving from generous to exceptional to name your price. When Mason continued to ignore them, a formal letter arrived, suggesting that Mason might be in possession of stolen property and offering to resolve the matter discreetly. "They're getting desperate," Mason observed, showing the letter to Jake, "which means we're onto something significant." Jake nodded grimly. "Our tech guy finally cracked the encryption on that microchip. You're going to want to see this yourself." And in Mason's home office, Jake connected a secure laptop to a projector. This chip contained financial data, very specific financial data, insider trading information, offshore account numbers, records of bribes to agricultural inspectors and racing officials, all tied to Westridge Agricultural Holdings. Mason studied the scrolling information with growing comprehension. They were using the horses as couriers. Microchips passed between conspirators at these private racing events, completely off the grid. Exactly, Jake confirmed. No electronic trail, no suspicious meetings between known associates, just wealthy enthusiasts gathering to watch horses race. Perfect cover for exchanging information that could crash companies or implicate powerful people in corruption. And Phoenix, Midnight Whisper, was carrying this particular chip when Thomas Wilson discovered the scheme. That's my guess. Wilson probably realized what was happening and tried to gather evidence before going public. But Westridge's people got to him first, seized most of the horses, and framed Wilson for financial crimes to destroy his credibility. Mason leaned back in his chair. So how did Phoenix end up at a slaughter auction 18 months later? Why not just dispose of him with the evidence? That's the part I can't figure out, Jake admitted. Unless Phoenix escaped during the initial raid, Mason finished the thought, and has been changing hands ever since, with no one realizing what he was carrying. A sharp knock at the door interrupted them. Elaine entered, her usually composed face tight with concern. "Mr. Whitfield, there's someone here to see you. She says it's urgent, about the horse." Mason exchanged glances with Jake, who subtly adjusted his jacket to access his concealed firearm. "Show them in." The woman who entered was in her early 30s, professionally dressed but visibly exhausted. She clutched a leather portfolio like a lifeline. "Mr. Whitfield, my name is Allison Wilson. Thomas Wilson was my father." 20 minutes later, Allison sat across from Mason in his study, hands wrapped around a cup of tea she hadn't touched. "I've been searching for Midnight Whisper for 18 months. When I heard rumors about a wealthy financier buying a mysterious thoroughbred at a slaughter auction, I hoped." "How did you find me?" Mason asked. "I'm a journalist," she explained. "Or I was, before finding Whisper became my full-time obsession. I still have sources." She set down her cup. "My father wasn't a criminal, Mr. Whitfield. He was set up because he discovered something he wasn't supposed to know." "About Richard Westridge's private racing circuit." Allison's eyes widened. "You know about that?" "I know they were using horses to transport encrypted financial data, and I know your father found out." She exhaled slowly, as if a great weight had been lifted. For 18 months I've been trying to prove that. No one would believe me. They all thought I was just a daughter unable to accept her father's crimes. Her voice cracked slightly. He didn't take his own life, you know. That was stage 2. Mason felt a chill. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry. Help me expose them. She opened her portfolio and extracted a USB drive. This contains everything I've gathered. Financial records showing how they framed my father. Witness statements that were suppressed. Photographs of Westridge with officials who later ruled against my father's appeals. It's not enough, is it? Mason guessed. Or you would have gone public already. No, it's not, she admitted. It's all circumstantial. They'd dismiss me as a grieving daughter chasing conspiracies. But with the microchip you found. Her eyes gleamed with a mixture of hope and determination. That's the physical evidence we need, proof that these weren't just horse races. They were exchanges of insider information worth millions. Mason studied Allison carefully. As a businessman, he'd developed an instinct for recognizing authenticity. Everything about her rang true, the exhaustion, the carefully restrained emotion, the single-minded focus. Ms. Wilson, going against someone like Richard Westridge isn't just professionally risky. If what you're suggesting is true, it could be dangerous. I'm well aware of the risks, Mr. Whitfield. I've been living with them since my father was taken. She leaned forward. But you're different. You have resources, influence. People listen when you speak. Before Mason could respond, his phone buzzed with a security alert. Jake, who had been monitoring the camera feeds on his tablet, stood abruptly. We have a breach on the east perimeter near the stables. Mason was already moving. How many? At least 3 figures approaching from the tree line. Security is responding, but a distant sound of breaking glass interrupted him. Allison jumped to her feet. They're here for Whisper. Mason turned to Jake. Secure Ms. Wilson, I'm going to the stables. Sir, that's not protocol. But Mason was already out the door, sprinting across the manicured lawn toward the stables. The night was clear, a full moon illuminating the rolling landscape of the Kentucky property. As he ran, Mason activated the emergency security protocols on his phone, a system that would lock down the main house and alert local authorities. He reached the stable just as 2 men in dark clothing were attempting to lead a reluctant Phoenix out the back entrance. The horse was resisting, rearing back against the lead rope. Let him go, Mason ordered, his voice carrying the authority that had intimidated boardrooms for decades. The men turned, clearly surprised by his arrival. One reached inside his jacket for what Mason didn't want to know. In that moment of hesitation, Phoenix reared violently, breaking free and galloping past them toward Mason. The distraction allowed Mason's security team to converge on the scene. The intruders, realizing they were outnumbered, fled into the surrounding woods. Jake arrived moments later with additional guards, immediately organizing a perimeter search. They had a vehicle waiting on the service road, he reported after receiving updates on his radio. We got a partial plate, but they're gone. Mason stroked Phoenix's neck, calming the agitated animal. They'll be back. Westridge has too much to lose if that microchip becomes public. Over the next hour, local police arrived and took statements, though. Mason noted their strange reluctance to pursue the case aggressively. One officer even suggested it might have been just some kids looking for trouble, despite the clear evidence of a coordinated intrusion. As the police departed, promising a follow-up that Mason doubted would come, Allison approached him by the stables. Now, do you believe me about Westridge's influence? Mason nodded grimly. We need to move quickly. They'll try again, and next time they'll come with more men. What's your plan? Mason considered the question carefully. Throughout his career, he'd faced corporate raiders, hostile takeovers, and unscrupulous competitors. This situation required the same strategic thinking, but with far higher stakes. First, we secure the evidence. I have connections at the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, people outside Westridge's sphere of influence. We deliver the microchip and your research directly to them." "And Whisper?" Allison asked, watching the horse that had become the center of this dangerous game. "He comes with us. He's still a target, and I'm not leaving him behind." By dawn, preparations were underway. Mason's private security team arranged for unmarked vehicles and a horse trailer with modified tracking systems. The microchip was secured in a specialized container that would prevent remote wiping or damage. As they worked, Mason found himself in a rare moment of quiet with Phoenix. The horse seemed to sense the gravity of the situation, standing still and alert as Mason checked the special padding designed to protect his still healing body during transport. "You've been carrying this burden for too long," Mason murmured, running his hand along the animal's powerful neck. Almost there now. Unexpectedly, Mason thought of his father again, of the emptiness in the old man's eyes during those final days. The realization that all his wealth and power meant nothing in the end because he'd never stood for anything beyond his own enrichment. For the first time in years, Mason felt a clarity of purpose that had nothing to do with profit margins or market share. This wasn't just about exposing corruption or even justice for Thomas Wilson. It was about finally taking a stand, using his resources for something that mattered. As the first rays of sunlight crested the hills, Mason received an urgent call from one of his corporate investigators in New York. The news confirmed his worst suspicions. Frederick Lansing, his closest business partner and friend of 20 years, had substantial hidden investments in Westridge Agricultural Holdings, investments that would be devastated if the company faced federal investigation. "Sir?" Jake approached with a secure phone. "We've established contact with the FBI agent you mentioned. She's agreed to meet us at the location we discussed." Mason took the phone, still processing the revelation about Frederick. If his own partner was compromised, who else in his circle might be working against him? The circle of trust had just grown considerably smaller. As he finalized arrangements with the FBI contact, Mason glanced toward Allison, who was gently stroking Phoenix's muzzle. Father and daughter, both destroyed by the same corrupt system, both now depending on him to help set things right. The weight of this responsibility should have felt alien to a man who had spent decades focused solely on his own interests. Instead, it settled on Mason's shoulders with a strange sense of rightness, as if he'd been preparing for this moment his entire life without knowing it. "It's time," he said quietly, bringing the conversation to a close. "We leave in 30 minutes. What Mason couldn't know was that at that very moment, Richard Westridge was sitting in his opulent office, overlooking his private racetrack, receiving updates on the failed attempt to retrieve Phoenix. His handsome face, usually arranged in the charismatic smile that had charmed politicians and business leaders alike, was now hard with anger. "Find out everything about Whitfield," he ordered the nervous assistant standing before him. "Every weakness, every pressure point, every skeleton in his closet. No one threatens what I've built. No one." The journey to the secure location where they would meet the FBI agent was tense. Mason drove the lead vehicle himself, with Jake beside him, monitoring the security feeds from cameras positioned around their small convoy. Allison traveled in the second vehicle with additional security, while Phoenix was transported in a custom horse trailer, modified with security features that would make an armored car envious. "Still no sign of pursuit," Jake reported, eyes fixed on his tablet. "But that doesn't mean they're not tracking us." Mason nodded, his attention divided between the road ahead and the rearview mirror. The weight of the encrypted data they carried, evidence that could topple one of the most influential agricultural empires in the country, pressed on him like a physical burden. His phone rang, the secure line he'd established for this operation. "Whitfield," he answered tersely. "Mason, it's Frederick." The familiar voice of his business partner filled the car's speakers. What the hell are you doing? I'm getting calls from people very concerned about your activities. Mason exchanged a glance with Jake before responding. I imagine you are, considering your investment portfolio. A pause. So, you know that you've secretly invested millions in Westridge's operations. Yes, I know. The question is why, Frederick? We've been partners for 20 years. Frederick's sigh came through clearly. It started as just another investment opportunity. Richard approached me personally, said he had a special arrangement for select investors. Returns like I'd never seen before. By the time I realized what was really happening, I was already implicated. You could have come to me and said what? That I'd invested in a company using thoroughbreds to transport insider trading data. That I was benefiting from information that was destroying other businesses. Frederick's voice hardened. We're not so different, Mason. We've both crossed lines for profit. There's a difference between aggressive business tactics and criminal conspiracy, Mason replied, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. Richard knows you have the chip, Frederick continued, ignoring Mason's distinction. He's mobilizing everything, calling in favors from judges, law enforcement, even senators. Whatever you think you're doing, it won't work. We'll see. Mason, be reasonable. Cut a deal. Turn over the horse and the chip, and this all goes away. You go back to your comfortable life, and nobody gets hurt. The implication was clear. Mason felt a cold anger rising within him. Is that a threat, Frederick? It's reality. Richard doesn't lose, Mason. Ever. First time for everything, Mason replied and ended the call. Jake looked at him with concern. He'll tell Westridge where we're heading. I'm counting on it, Mason said, a plan forming in his mind. Call Agent Pearson. Tell her there's been a change. 2 hours later, their convoy pulled into an abandoned riding academy tucked away in the hills of eastern Kentucky. The facility, once prestigious but now dilapidated, had been chosen for its isolation and multiple access routes. As they secured Phoenix in the main stable, Mason outlined his revised strategy to Jake, Allison, and Agent Pearson, a no-nonsense FBI veteran who had arrived ahead of them. Westridge knows we're meeting with the FBI, Mason explained. What he doesn't know is exactly what evidence we have, or who else might have copies. That's our leverage. Agent Pearson nodded thoughtfully. We need to be careful. Westridge has friends in high places, people who could bury this investigation before it starts. Agree, which is why we need to make it too big to bury, Allison interjected. My contacts at major news outlets are ready. Once they have the full story, with evidence, it becomes much harder for anyone to make it disappear. Mason turned to Jake. What about the satellite uplink? Ready. We can broadcast everything simultaneously to multiple secure servers and news organizations. Even if they manage to intercept us here, the information gets out. As they finalized preparations, Mason stepped outside for a moment alone. The sun was setting behind the hills, painting the Kentucky landscape in shades of gold and crimson. He found himself thinking about the strange journey that had led him here, how a simple act of compassion for an animal had snowballed into the biggest challenge of his life. His phone buzzed, another call from Frederick. Mason hesitated, then answered. It's not too late, Frederick said without preamble. Richard is willing to be generous. 10 million for the horse and all related materials. No questions asked. Who thought it was never about money, Frederick? Then what is it about? Playing hero. That's not you, Mason. You're a businessman, not a crusader. The accusation stung because there was truth in it. For most of his life, Mason had been exactly what Frederick described, focused solely on profit and personal gain, indifferent to larger questions of right and wrong. Maybe it's time for a change, Mason replied quietly. Frederick scoffed. Richard is 20 minutes from your location with enough men to ensure this ends his way. Last chance. Goodbye, Frederick. Inside the main building, Mason found Allison working with Agent Pearson to organize the evidence for transmission. Years of meticulous research, combined with the explosive data from the microchip, painted a damning picture of corruption that stretched from local racing officials to the highest levels of state government. "We're ready, Agent," Pearson announced, checking her watch. "Backup should be here in 15 minutes. Mason nodded, then turned to Jake. "Start the transmission now. We can't risk waiting." As Jake initiated the satellite uplink, the sound of vehicles approaching filtered through the old building. Mason moved to the window, watching as 3 black SUVs pulled into the yard, followed by a luxury sedan. "They're here," he said calmly. "Earlier than expected." Agent Pearson drew her weapon. "My team won't make it in time." "They don't need to," Mason replied. "The evidence is already transmitting. In 5 minutes it will be in the hands of every major news outlet and federal agency." Outside, men in tactical gear deployed around the perimeter. From the sedan emerged Richard Westridge, himself, tall, distinguished, with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way. Frederick Lansing exited behind him, looking considerably less assured. Mason stepped onto the porch to meet them, alone but entirely composed. "Mr. Whitfield," Westridge called, his voice carrying the practiced charm that had won over countless politicians and business leaders. "I believe we have a misunderstanding that needs resolving." "No misunderstanding, Mr. Westridge. You've been using horses to transport insider trading information. You destroyed Thomas Wilson when he discovered your scheme, and now you're here to silence us before we can expose you." Westridge's smile didn't falter, but his eyes hardened. "Serious accusations require serious evidence, Mr. Whitfield. Evidence I'm confident you don't have. The microchip we found in Phoenix's saddle suggests otherwise, as does Ms. Wilson's extensive documentation of your activities. A fabrication, I'm sure, easily discredited by the proper authorities." Westridge gestured casually, and his men moved closer to the building. "Now, if you'll just turn over the horse and any materials you believe implicate me, we can avoid unnecessary unpleasantness." Mason checked his watch. "You're too late. The evidence is already being transmitted to multiple secure locations. In approximately 2 minutes, your entire operation will be exposed to federal agencies and the media simultaneously." For the first time, Westridge's composure slipped. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" "You've built your empire on secrets, Mr. Westridge. How many people know about your private racing circuit? About the bribes, the insider trading, the systematic destruction of anyone who gets in your way?" Mason stepped forward. "Secrets only work when they stay secret." Westridge turned to one of his men. "Cut the power. Jam all communications." "Already." "Tried, sir," the man replied nervously. "There's a satellite uplink we can't interrupt." As Westridge processed this information, a series of police and FBI vehicles appeared on the horizon, sirens wailing. Frederick approached Mason, panic evident in his expression. "What have you done?" "What you should have done years ago," Mason replied. "Stood up to him." The next few hours unfolded in a blur of activity. FBI agents secured the premises, collected evidence, and took statements. Richard Westridge was escorted away in handcuffs, his famous charm replaced by cold fury. Several of his associates, including local officials who had arrived to support him, found themselves similarly detained. Frederick was taken in for questioning, though Mason, despite everything, arranged for legal representation for his former partner. Some loyalties ran too deep to be completely severed, even by betrayal. As the chaos subsided, Mason found Allison sitting beside Phoenix in the stable, her face streaked with tears of relief. "It's really over," she murmured, stroking the horse's muzzle. "Dad can rest now." Mason nodded, understanding the mixture of grief and vindication she must be feeling. "What will you do now?" he asked. Allison smiled faintly. "Back to journalism, I think. There's a book in this story somewhere." She looked up at him. "And you? Back to Wall Street?" The question gave Mason pause. For weeks, his corporate responsibilities had taken a back seat to this unexpected crusade. Strangely, he hadn't missed them. The adrenaline of billion-dollar deals had never given him the sense of purpose he'd found in this Kentucky barn, standing beside a horse that had somehow changed the trajectory of his life. "I'm considering a change of scenery," he said finally. "Rolling Hills has potential beyond what I initially saw." In the days that followed, the Westridge scandal dominated headlines nationwide. The investigation expanded to include dozens of influential figures who had benefited from the insider trading network. Thomas Wilson's name was cleared posthumously, his reputation restored by the very evidence he had died trying to secure. Mason found himself declining invitations to appear on news programs or give interviews. Instead, he focused on transforming Rolling Hills Ranch into something new, a sanctuary for rescued horses and a rehabilitation center for equine therapy. The irony wasn't lost on him. A man who had spent decades accumulating wealth was now finding fulfillment in giving it away. Phoenix, fully recovered and vibrant with health, became the centerpiece of the sanctuary. Mason often found himself simply watching the horse interact with other rescued animals, marveling at the resilience that had carried him through so much trauma. One autumn afternoon, 6 months after the confrontation with Westridge, Mason sat on the veranda of the main house, reviewing plans for the sanctuary's expansion. Elaine approached with her tablet, a rare occurrence these days, as she had gradually adjusted to his less demanding schedule. "Sir, the board is requesting your presence in New York next week for the quarterly meeting," she said, her tone suggesting she already knew his answer. Mason glanced past her to where Phoenix grazed peacefully in the distance. "Schedule a video conference instead. I have more important matters to attend to here." Elaine nodded, the faintest smile playing at her lips. "Of course, Mr. Whitfield." As she departed, Mason returned to his contemplation of the rolling Kentucky, hills that had become his home. In the financial world, he had been respected and feared, but ultimately alone. Here, surrounded by creatures who asked nothing of him but kindness, he had found something that had eluded him his entire life, a sense of belonging. Phoenix looked up from grazing, as if sensing Mason's gaze. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance, the thoroughbred who had carried secrets that toppled an empire, and the man who had found his conscience while saving a horse from slaughter. In that silent exchange, Mason felt a profound sense of gratitude. His impulsive purchase hadn't just saved Phoenix's life, it had saved his own as well, rescuing him from the gilded isolation that had been slowly consuming him. As the sun began to set behind the trees, casting long shadows across the property, Mason made a silent promise to the horse that had changed everything. Rolling Hills would stand as a testament to second chances, for the animals it sheltered, for the people it healed, and for a man who had discovered late, but not too late, that true wealth lay not in what you possessed, but in what you stood for. In the distance, Phoenix returned to his grazing, content in his new life, and Mason Whitfield, once defined solely by the fortune he had built, began to imagine a legacy measured instead by the lives he had changed, beginning with his own. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Mason and Phoenix has touched your heart. To continue this emotional journey, we've prepared a special playlist with equally captivating stories. Find it by clicking on the link to your left. If you enjoyed this tale of redemption and purpose, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day, we bring unique stories that explore life's complexities and the unexpected connections that change us forever. What would you have done in Mason's position? What animal has changed your life? We're waiting to hear your thoughts in the comments below.